Hello and welcome to We Can Work It Out, the podcast that explores the history, present, and future of workers' rights. I'm your host, Dr. Jonathan Lord. In each episode, we'll be delving into the stories, struggles, and successes that have shaped working lives. From friendly societies to people management, we welcome academics, activists, trade unionists, policymakers, and workers themselves to help us understand what fair work really means in a changing world. This episode's guest is Professor Richard Hyman, who is widely recognised as one of the founding figures of modern industrial relations scholarship. He is Emeritus Professor of Industrial Relations at the London School of Economics and Honorary Professor at the University of Warwick, where he helped establish the internationally renowned Industrial Relations Research Unit. Over the last 5 decades, Richard's research has profoundly shaped how academics, policymakers, and trade unions understand the dynamics of power, conflict, and cooperation in the workplace. His early works, such as the seminal Industrial Relations and Marxist Introduction, the political economy of industrial relations, and strikes, pioneered critical approaches to the study of labour and capital, positioning employment relations within broader social and political structures. Richard was also a founding editor of the European Journal of Industrial Relations and has written extensively on European trade unionism, collective bargaining, and the changing nature of worker representation under neoliberalism. His comparative research has influenced debates and the future of organised labour across the continent. His latest book, A Concise Introduction to Employment Relations, distills a lifetime of research into an accessible yet theoretically rich account of how employment relations have evolved over the past 50 years. It traces key transformations in work organisation, state regulation, and union power, while inviting readers to consider what fair work might mean in an era of fragmentation, automation, and globalisation. Richard remains a leading intellectual voice in the study of work and society, combining historical perspective, critical theory, and moral purpose in his analysis of how we can build more democratic and humane systems of employment. Professor Richard Hyman, welcome to We Can Work It Out.
Thank you, and thank you for the introduction.
Thanks, Richard. It's a delight to have you on the podcast. Can we just start off by asking you about yourself and how you became a leading scholar in industrial relations?
Well, some people have a clear career plan, or at least looking backwards, they think they had one. I certainly can't claim that. I got into industrial relations more or less by accident, partly because I was a linguist. Then I didn't like the language course that was on offer when I went to university, so I did philosophy, politics, and economics instead, which gives you a bit of everything without any depth, particularly anything particular. I went on to do my doctorate. I was very interested in workers' control and initially was accepted to study an aspect of workers' control in Yugoslavia. I discovered that I had pretty good serbo-croat for working as a tourist, but not good enough to do detailed case study research, and that I was not going to get up to speed soon enough to write a PhD in the time available. So I switched into trade union history, and it led on from there. And I suppose what I'd have to say is that achieving a certain degree of success reflected the fact that I was in the right place at the right time. It was a period when I started when there was a lot of concern about industrial relations. People talked about the strike problem in Britain, which was always exaggerated, but nevertheless, it seemed to be a period with a lot of industrial conflict, with a big expansion of trade unionism, with a lot of public concern about how one could reorganize industrial relations. So they were looking for people to study and teach about it. And it was a period when the university sector was expanding rapidly. It was also a period when there was when academic liberalism still meant something. So even though I was in many ways an unorthodox and dissident student, I was given a chance to enter academic life. And it was a period when unions, or when universities had not yet become commercial organizations solely concerned with the bottom line. So it was a very favorable time, and I think in any other historical moment, I wouldn't have had the opportunity.
That's a really interesting trajectory, because we spoke to a few other industrial relations academics, and they've all said they started out doing one thing and then they've kind of gone into academia because of what they maybe have experienced and what they've wanted to talk about and research as well. So it's actually quite a common trajectory for a lot of academics.
Yeah,
Um, it's similar to mine, not as grand as yours, but I was quite similar. Worked in the rail industry, and I saw a few things, and you notice how things work. And thought it'd be interesting to research it more and teach about it more to try and educate about the workplace, because I don't think it certainly didn't happen at the time anyway.
yeah.
So
I mean, it's
you
very easy in retrospect to construct a more linear story of one's own life than is really the case. I mean, one, not that people are being dishonest, but it's neater that way. But reality is usually rather messy.
more interesting, and it probably helps as
Yep.
well. So you've been studying industrial relations for a long time now, which is why you're so well respected. When you look back, what do you see as the most profound changes in employment relations since that early period in the early 70s?
Obviously, the decline in union membership and union organisation, the decline in collective bargaining, the hollowing out of autonomous workplace organisation. It's partly related to the restructuring of industry, that the areas that were strongly collectivised in many cases have disappeared. They were replaced for a while by the public sector, but we know what's happened in the public sector in recent decades. And globalisation has obviously constrained the opportunities for powerful worker organisation winning major concessions. And there's been a shift towards much more aggressive policies by both employers and by governments. At one point, I talked about the tradition of unscientific management in Britain.
Yeah.
So employers have been forced to get their act together, and as part of getting their act together, to assert control over industrial relations in a way which they didn't have before.
Yeah, you talk about control a lot, don't you, in your work? I know it's a big aspect of what you like to kind of explain and digest and reflect upon.
Yeah.
Y-
Yeah.
Yeah. Your new book offers a kind of a concise but reflective overview of the history of what you just talked about. What prompted you to write about it now, and what audience did you have in mind for it?
Again, it might sound flippant, but I wrote the book because I was asked to do so. I was approached, I mean, not something that had occurred to me before that I would go back to it. My feeling was I've been there, I've done that. But a publisher said, we've got this interesting idea, what do you think about it? And I reflected a bit, and things have changed so much over half a century that why not step back and say, what has changed, what has remained, in some ways the same? How can one make sense of the developments over the last 50 years? Let's go for it. Um, well, the audience, I think, as you suggested, I wanted to produce a book that was readable but not simplistic, and in principle one that anyone interested in the subject could get into, and I hope take away something from.
Drilling down into some of the aspects then of the book, going back to the 1970s again, collective bargaining and trade union density was central to the employment landscape. You kind of intimated this with your own journey. How do you think that decline of those institutions altered the balance of power between labour and capital?
I think that the institutional change happened because the balance of power had already shifted, but in many ways it's reinforced the shift, and has therefore weakened the capacity of labour to organise its own project collectively, even though it hasn't eliminated it. And I think that's important to insist. There is always reaction. There's always the development of alternative ideas about how work should be organised, how society should be organised. That hasn't been abolished. It's simply been made more difficult, I think.
Yeah, it seems like there's been a golden thread of that. Collectivism has never disappeared. Would you say over the last 50 years it's changed more in terms of the restrictions of collective action and collective protection than it has over the last, say, 300 years?
300 years is going back a long time. There have been a lot of changes in that
I know,
period
yeah.
as well. I think what one can say from certainly the mid-century, the post-war period, there were several decades of institutional stability, and that has then altered radically.
To what extent do you think the changes are cyclical, shaped by economic crisis, for example, versus structural, which is embedded in new forms of capitalism?
I think it has to be both.
Yeah.
But I would tend to say that the structural changes were probably more decisive, because the trajectory has been mainly in one direction with, if you like, variations around that downward trajectory if one is looking at the strength of institutions and collective regulation. So yeah, the structural changes, I think, are the primary factor.
How much do you think the political power has had an influence over the rules and regulations that you've mentioned?
Great deal, I would say. If one goes back to the mid-century, there was what some scholars have called a post-war compromise in most Western European countries, and Britain was no exception to this. There was I think, a general feeling among governments, among employers, that if you wanted to stabilise capitalism, you needed some reforms that benefited workers. You needed some rights for workers within their employment. That trade unions needed to have a role in shaping the industrial relations agenda. And that was more or less a consensus, certainly in Britain, but I think in many other countries as well. It meant that in Britain in particular, it was widely believed that capital, which was still primarily national in character on the one hand, and trade unions that were still affected by what some have called the depression mentality. Most workers and most trade union organisers had grown up in the interwar period of mass unemployment, of wage cuts, of being very much on the defensive, were still shaped by that experience. And in a sense, getting relatively full employment, getting modest but continuous wage increases, that was nirvana, and it was possible for employers and unions in that context to reach agreements, and it also meant that governments didn't need to be visibly and actively involved in industrial relations, and that I think was the post-war model, which shaped British industrial relations up until the 1960s. As we know, that is another world, and things have changed radically since then.
Can I ask you about the iron rule of the oligarchy? Because you've talked about that in your book, and it's only something which I've really started to read up on over the last couple of years, really, because I think it's become a bit more prominent and a bit more of a discussion. Would you be able to explain what it is and how it's become apparent in terms of trade union activity or trade union discussion anyway?
Well, the iron law of oligarchy was a concept invented by a German political scientist called Robert Michels, and he wrote a book called Political Parties, or at least in English it's called Political Parties. It has a rather more complicated title in German. And I always say what he wrote was two books in one. One book he wrote was a fairly subtle and sophisticated analysis, primarily of social democratic parties, but he argued it also applied to trade unions. But writing a sophisticated and subtle book doesn't necessarily sell all that many copies. So he also made it a potboiler. And it was in that context he came up with the argument that who says organisation says oligarchy, that any collective organisation is going to become increasingly authoritarian and centralised, and in a sense would subvert its own democratic purposes. So that was his argument. And I would say it's a half-truth. And the thing about half-truths is they're half true, but they're half false. And I think that's the case with the iron law of oligarchy.
Yeah. I was going to ask whether you thought after that Second World War, post-war period, where there was all those kind of voluntary systems in place, and then it suddenly changed, didn't it, in the 60s and 70s, whether the unions started to behave like oligarchies, or whether they did have too much power.
And I think the first thing to say is that unions, and in particular in Britain, are extremely diverse. Some have much stronger traditions of internal democracy than others. There was one very important writer in the 60s through into the 70s called Bert Turner, who's not very well read these days, but he wrote a fascinating study of the Lancashire cotton trade unions. And he tried to make that from that a sort of more general argument about trade unions. And he distinguished in particular between unions with a strong tradition of democracy, in many cases craft unions or former craft unions, with a deeply embedded local autonomy, often a relatively homogeneous membership. And he argued that unions of this kind could sustain very active internal democracy. And he had a contrasting concept of what he called popular bostums. I suppose his absolute model there was the very large general unions. And he argued that they were so sprawling, so heterogeneous, that you could only maintain a collective identity and a collective purpose if you had very strong authoritative and perhaps sometimes authoritarian leadership. And again, there's an important element of truth, I think. It is, in the main, the smaller, more specialised trade unions which have more active internal democracy. It's very hard to maintain that sort of participatory membership structure if you're extremely diverse, covering large numbers of different occupations and different industries.
Marxism's played an important part of your writing.
Yes.
How important is it to you, and how has it influenced you, do you think?
I think it's an important way of making sense of the nature of capitalism, of its historical trajectory, of its internal contradictions, and hence the extent to which it contains possibilities of a number of different trajectories in the future. I don't think it's a recipe book. I don't think it's a Bible. But I think it has very fascinating ideas, which to me make sense, and make sense perhaps even more in the 21st century than it did in the 19th and 20th.
Mm. We had Professor Ralph Darlington on, which I mentioned before, and he mentioned Karl Marx as a big influence on his work and the world of work mainly. And he mentioned exactly the same thing. He said it wasn't really, you called it a recipe, which is probably a good way, or a Bible, but it does have the writings of it. The writings of Marx and Engels does have clear understandings of how to operate in certain ways, which can be taken on board or not. I think people focus too much on the outcome of maybe countries adopting it rather than the actual writings of it. I don't think people read what was actually outlined, and they just see the actual outcome of certain societies or systems, and that's why it probably gets characterized in a certain way.
Yeah, and part of the problem, I think, is that for many decades, Marxism became embraced as an official state religion in the Soviet Union and its satellites, a very distorted form of Marxism, and that, in a sense, poisoned its reputation in ways from which maybe the collapse of the Soviet Union has liberated us from that inheritance and offers new ways of perceiving its possibilities.
I was going to ask that. Do you still, it's written a lot, a while ago, but do you still think it still has relevance in a modern society where we do have different ways of working?
Absolutely. I mean, Marx was writing the best part of 2 centuries ago. He wasn't a prophet. He predicted some things which haven't happened. But if one looks at the whole corpus of his work, I mean, what is remarkable is how prescient he was about many of the things which have happened in the world since he was writing. And I think there is still a lot that we can take from that.
If we move on to the expansion of individual employment rights, which I would probably argue, really happened from the late 1960s, early 70s as a result of the Donovan Commission. Some people have seen it as progress. You've argued that it can depoliticize the employment relationship. Can you explain that tension for us?
Yes, the relationship between individual rights and collective rights is always very complex. And I suppose the relationship between what people sometimes call negative rights and positive rights. British industrial relations developed in the main on the basis of negative immunities, as they were called at the time, which meant, in effect, the law shouldn't interfere and unions should be able to get on with it.
Yeah.
And that was a very powerful tradition within British trade unionism, which distinguished this country very much from most other European countries, I think. And this meant, for example, that to secure individual rights, workers tended to be very dependent on collective action. If a worker felt they were unfairly treated, they looked to collective action, possibly official trade union, but often just workers together saying, when this is unacceptable. And there were changes initially in the 1960s, 1970s, laws on redundancy, then laws on unfair dismissal. Some of these slightly predated Donovan, but Donovan certainly reinforced the trend. And I think some of those who advocated these laws saw them as a way of reducing the incentive to act collectively. To some extent, turning employment rights into a commodity almost, because the legislation on redundancy was the Redundancy Payments Act. It didn't protect you against redundancy. It gave you a payment if you were made redundant. I think many would say unfair dismissal. Again, it didn't make it impossible to dismiss someone. It certainly simply meant that if it was shown to be unfair, then you got compensation. And this individualized and I would say commoditized employment and could be seen as a way of weakening the collective. That legislation means, for example, if people if a shop steward said, this your colleague is being unfairly dismissed, previously the odds are that they would have walked out. Now they can say, well, they can go to a tribunal and the union can represent them. So I think there's a good case for saying those pieces of legislation, perhaps intentionally, undermine collective solidarity.
We've seen that in the P&O seafarer sacking scandal. We've just done some research with 69 of the seafarers that were sacked, and 2/3 of them haven't gone back, haven't stayed in the seafarer industry, they've left. And we found out that because they were sacked on the day, there was no recourse for trade union action, really, because they were no longer staff members of P&O, no longer employees of P&O. So they circumvented a lot of the laws there. So I like the way you've kind of framed that. It is a commodity because they effectively paid them off, so they didn't go to a tribunal, and that was it. But they weren't held to account for the actual sackings P&O, which is what the big issue was. And if the trade unions had the proper power behind them in terms of legislation, then they will have probably stopped it, hopefully. You talk about legalism early in your writings, that it can, legalism as a substitute for collective power, and you've warned against that. You kind of intimated it. Have you been proved right that it has depowered workers' rights, this individual employment law?
I think probably. Though, I mean, that was not an original argument. Over a century ago, Antonio Gramsci developed the idea of what he called industrial legality. And he said, in effect, it's very valuable to have the rules on your side. And trade unions have been able to win what he called the industrial legality. And that was a great achievement, but it only took you so far. And the great danger was to see this as having resolved all the problems and sit back and enjoy the new rule-based framework. And if I can take an instance of from a very different country, from Germany, a colleague, Anke Hassel, wrote an article a couple of decades ago in which she talked about what she called the curse of institutional security. And she said, in particular in Germany, but elsewhere, obviously, as well. Trade unions got a lot of institutional rights. They were recognised interlocutors of governments. They had representation rights at the workplace. They had a whole framework of legal supports. And I recall, if you went into a trade union office in Germany many decades ago, one of the things you would see on the officials, in the official's office, was a bookshelf full of legal tomes, and it made you dependent on the legal support, with two interlocking consequences. One is, if you had the law on your side, you didn't need collective strength. But the rules might change. And it was easier to change the rules against your interests if you didn't have the collective power to defend them. So this is always the double-edged nature, I think, of legalism. As I say, not that having legal rights is necessarily a bad thing. And in a period when trade unions are weaker, when workers are more vulnerable, I think it's ridiculous to suggest that we shouldn't have legal rights. We just have to recognise, I think, that having the law on the books is one step, making them a reality, making these rights embedded is a different challenge altogether. And one has to have the capacity not only to get the rules in the book, but to enforce them in the workplace.
Yeah, I've always argued that you need both. I don't think we can get away from the legalism now. But if you have both, why wouldn't you have both? You'd have the collective power of the unions and have the legislation as well. Do you think two can work together, or do you think collectivism is the only answer?
No, I'm sure the two can work together, but it's a very delicate balancing act. It needs sophistication, it needs strategic wisdom.
A lot of organisations and governments don't seem to have that art of negotiation anymore. They've seemed to have lost that industrial relations skill set where they are able to bargain and consult with the trade unions. Do you think that has had an impact on why legalism has kind of increased?
I think it is in part. Of course, if the skills were the products of an era in which the other side lacked the competence to negotiate effectively from their side, in some ways you had it easy. I think adapting the skills to a more difficult environment is a challenge which is far harder to accomplish.
Can we move on to Europe? Because you've written and talked a lot about globalisation, Europe, and you can compare different systems throughout those countries in the EU. But how has EU integration and globalisation in general reshaped the space for national labour regulation?
A very complex and in some ways contradictory relationship between globalisation and EU regulation. In some ways, one could see the EU as a protection against globalisation. The notion that individual countries are extremely vulnerable, acting together within a common framework of rules, they can have stronger protections. Certainly, EU legislation, particularly in the 1990s perhaps, brought significant trade union rights and worker rights to countries which had weak legal protections. Less significant, I think, for countries already with a very strong rights-based framework. But to a large degree, the so-called social dimension, the industrial relations protections, were subordinated to so-called competitiveness, the notion that the economic project of the EU was predominant and workers could have rights where they contributed to competitiveness, but not where they obstructed it. And we saw that in particular under Barroso, where a very neoliberal EU project was enforced.
You've talked about how European trade unions have existed between market class and society. How have these tensions played out in an age of austerity and now populism?
I was trying to make sense of the great diversity of trade unionisms across Europe. Why are French trade unions so different from German trade unions, for example? Why are both of them so different from British trade unionism? And I thought it was a useful heuristic device to see industrial relations as a field of tension between three orientations, as you say, market, class, and society. And it seemed to me that the way in which trade unionism in individual countries managed this tension tended to be distinctive and tended to be path dependent, so that there was significant continuity in the orientations of trade unions over time within each country.
Are there lessons from continental Europe then, such as the social partnership or co-determination, that the UK could adopt to rebuild collective voices at work?
Social partnership, co-determination, very different beasts, I think.
Yeah.
I mean, social partnership, it seems to me, is usually a euphemism for employer domination. I mean, it's very curious if you look at trade union leaders in Britain over recent decades. An awful lot of old leftists suddenly appear as advocates of social partnership. It seems to me social partnership is, as a language of trade unionism, tends to be a reflection of weakness. Now, there's no point being militant, being obstructive simply for the sake of it. If you can get, I mean, William Morris had the slogan, I think, peacefully if we may, forcefully if we must, and I think that's a good motto for trade unions.
Yeah.
If you can negotiate, then and get what you need, then that's fine. You should be prepared that the other side won't be a partner unless you're a partner on their terms. So I think one should be very wary about the idea of social partnership. Co-determination. I had a debate 30 years ago with my colleague and friend John Kelly, and he developed a very powerful argument why we must reject co-determination. Now, half a century ago, I'd have been in the same camp, but it seemed to me that after the ravages of Thatcherism, with trade unions much weaker, co-determined might be the least worst option. If framed correctly, co-determination rights would give union activists a status within the workplace which they could build on, and I think that was a correct argument. Now, it's not on the political agenda now anyway, but I think one shouldn't reject an institution simply because it's not the ideal.
But you're right, though. It should be a case of trying to resolve something, and then if that isn't resolved, then the ultimate action, which a trade union should have, is that removal of labour. I don't understand why that isn't a written rule in the UK. I know it's not a legally binding thing, but it should be really. The withdrawal of labour is the biggest side of the power that the workers have and the unions have.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I mean, very few workers are trigger happy. Some of the activists and some of the unions perhaps are, but they'll fight to the last drop of their members' blood. But in the main, workers see it as sensible to try to get what you can peacefully, and only if you can't do you then move on to the next stage.
Yeah. What do you make of the emerging forms of worker organisation, from platform workers forming their own unions to grassroots campaigns that operate outside the traditional structures of trade unions?
I think it's very clear that most of the traditional methods of unionisation don't really work with precarious workers. To start with, many of them don't have a fixed workplace. So the whole idea of workplace organisation simply doesn't fit. Many unions have been experimenting, some with at least a degree of success, to find alternative ways of filling the vacuum, including through digital methods, and many other organisations also filling the gap in very different ways. An interesting analytical discussion, I've had a piece recently which distinguished what was called collective logics and connective logics. Collective, the traditional old way, acting together as a group. Connective being linked together through the internet or other digital form. And the arguments of this piece, and I think it's correct, is we need to find how we can link the two. Platform workers certainly have been able to develop connective logic. So it's a whole part of the nature of the work that they're connected the whole time. And the key question is how you can move from connective to collective. And conversely, one might argue if traditional forms of collectivity are less available, one has to find ways in which connectivity can compensate and how the two can work together. So I think this is a key challenge for trade unions in the 21st century.
Yeah, I like that analogy with the two words because you have talked about, linking it to Braverman and the control and the resistance at work. Do you think there are different or similar dynamics in terms of control and resistance with algorithmic management and the increase of artificial intelligence?
I'm not a prophet. What I would say is that control and resistance are intrinsic within the labour process, whatever its form, whatever its technology, and even as the labour process changes, certain of the underlying dynamics remain relatively constant. I don't believe in technological determinism. I think any type of technology contains both constraints and opportunities. And ingenuity, and workers are still ingenious, ingenuity can find how one can overcome the obstacles and how one can utilize the opportunities.
Because it can, the technological changes can repeat old patterns, can't it, of de-skilling and controlling workers? That's what people are wary of at the moment, I think.
Yeah, de-skilling and autonomy can both be inherent among the possibilities. Even though today the starting point is very different from the starting point a few decades ago. As is always the case, technology itself is not determinant. It's an instrument in an ongoing struggle over control.
Do you think, given the rise of precarious and non-standard employment, the concept of employment relations itself needs to be rethinked?
Yeah, I mean, my latest book has the title Employment Relations. That was the publisher.
I was nervous about asking that question, actually.
Yeah, that was the publisher's preference. They have to be concerned with what they think is in the market for the book. I mean, it's clear that industrial relations is a misnomer, or else, it's a term which was invented more than a century ago. Doesn't mean a lot to those not in the know. In some ways, it's a misnomer because industry, if by industry one means heavy manufacturing, is a relatively minor part of today's employment. Employment relations, to some extent, a misnomer in that much work today does not take the form of direct employment, and the boundaries of work and employment have become increasingly uncertain. Now one can argue for years over what's a better title, and I don't have any answer there. But sure, employment relations shouldn't be a constraint when one adopts a label.
Can we just reflect a little bit now, because we're kind of coming towards the end? You're still at the forefront of writing. I want to emphasize that because your book demonstrates that you've looked at what's happened over the last 50 years, but what's the current outlook in terms of employment relations? Over the last 50 years, though, what do you think has been the constant throughout employment relations, despite all the changes?
I would say the struggle over control and resistance remains central. There was a writer, Mark quotes him indeed, a writer called Andrew Ewer, who in 1835 wrote a book called The Philosophy of Manufactures. And he had a very striking phrase: when capital enlists science into her service, the refractory hand of labour will be taught docility. He was wrong. And if people think they're being pushed too hard, if they think they're being treated as adjuncts of a machine rather than as individuals with their own characteristics, their own interests, their own values, they will object in whatever way they can. And if employers are intelligent, they will anticipate this and build it into their own strategy. So what remains constant, I think, is the degree to which people at work have their own values. They have their own preferences. They have their own lives to lead, which is not simply the life in the workplace. And the challenge at a different level is whether it's possible to build a society in which people have the opportunity to develop their own capacities and not simply be taught docility by managers and their academic gurus.
But we saw that, didn't we? Especially during COVID and after COVID initially, of the quiet quitting phenomenon where people did quit the jobs and did go into roles that they wanted to do, into work that they were more interested in, rather than just doing a job for the sake of it. They had the opportunity to go into or to reskill and do something that they wanted to do rather than just having to work for the sake of it.
Absolutely. People talk about human resource management. They don't usually realise that this is a term which dehumanises the human beings who are central to the whole process.
But it's morphed, hasn't it, that term, welfare, personnel, human resource management, now people management, it has morphed in terms of its labelling. If you're advising a new generation of scholars or policymakers, then what questions do you think they should be asking about fairness and democracy at work?
I think probably the old questions. Why is so much work unfair and undemocratic? Why do many, perhaps most people, put up with it to the degree that they do? And what might be done about it?
And that's the question that's been asked persistently, hasn't it? So you're saying that it should always be asked. That should be a repetitive question. Are you optimistic or pessimistic then about the future of collective organisation in the future?
Again, to quote Gramsci, his motto was pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will. If one looks at what's going on in the world and indeed in this country, any intelligent analysis makes you wring your hands. But one shouldn't surrender. One shouldn't simply embrace defeatism. One needs to have a conception of how things might be better and a willingness to fight to make it so.
You said you've not a prophet, but what do you think industrial relations might look like in 50 years from now?
I think I have to insist I'm not a prophet, and I mean, it's not what one predicts. It's what one can help create. People with a vision of how things might be better have to organise and struggle to achieve it.
Okay, we asked the final two questions to every guest. What are you working on next?
I'm just, with my colleague, finishing a piece on trade unions and climate change, which may well lead into whether a paper or a book, I'm not sure, on the rise of the far right and the implications for industrial relations. What actually happens when the far right enters government? What are its policies for industrial relations?
Are you looking back at what's happened previously with that, or?
I'd agree, but I mean, what is striking about many European countries, including this one today, which is in some ways distinctive, is the extent to which the traditional constituency of trade unions is willing to support the far right. Often because they've been sold a false prospectus. It is very interesting seeing some of the recent survey evidence that to some extent, classic working class cadre support for reform are actually very committed to employment rights and a decent welfare system, whereas the official policies of the party they're voting for are completely the opposite. And when reality hits what will happen, and no one is sure. I mean, what one could say is that, for example, in Italy, where the far right is heading the government, they have tried to navigate this contradiction in ways which means that they are not behaving in straightforward far right, straightforward conservative, small state, anti-worker rights ways, which maybe ideologically they would want.
Yeah. It's a strange space, isn't it? Because I know there's lots of discussion, and we're going to have it on this podcast as well, where the working classes feel that that is the place where they want to go in terms of the political side of it, because their argument is that they're working class, they want workers' rights, and that's their belief, and they've been let down maybe by the Labour Party or whoever, and they've been let down, so they're seeking another political arena to try and get their rights and their beliefs in terms of their working class backgrounds. So do you think it is a new domain that will emerge because of that?
Well, and it's a very unpredictable one because their traditional party, and this is true not just in Britain but across Europe, in the United States, in as I say, most of the world's traditional working class parties have become, in a sense, apologists for neoliberalism, and the best they can offer is a slightly softer form of neoliberal politics. And it's clear that that is not seen as very attractive. And a large number of workers are fed up with it, understandably.
We ask each guest to choose one person or a group of people who they believe has influenced the world of work. What person or group of people would you select and why?
Well, I don't believe that great individuals are the decisive force in history. Some individuals are clearly important, but that's because circumstances make it possible for them. The dynamics are social and collective. So if one's talking about a group of people, I suppose I would say the ways in which ordinary people act socially and collectively. It's social movements which can be the decisive element in shaping and reshaping society.
And it's just the actors within that system that helps that, yeah?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Yeah, it's been an absolute pleasure, Richard. It really has. Your work has really influenced me. I know it's influenced a lot of people that I work with as well. So it's a genuine pleasure to find out your thoughts and your background, and more research and more outputs to come, hopefully, from you.
Thank you. It's been delightful talking to you.
Professor Richard Hyman, thank you for being on We Can Work It Out.